I say the word vagina more times before 12 noon than most people probably say in their lifetime. And I'm not a gynecologist. However, I am trained as an international attorney, artist, activist, educator, and yoga teacher, working on behalf of women and girls impacted by something that most of you probably haven't heard of since a college anthropology class. And that's the practice of female genital mutilation and cutting. For those of you who skipped that day in anthro, female genital mutilation and cutting is a 1,000-year-old practice involving the cutting or the complete removal of the clitoris and or the sewing together of the labias. Take a second and let that sink in. I said that female genital mutilation and cutting involves the cutting or the complete removal of the clitoris and or the sewing together of the labias. Now, before I get started, I want to stop. And I want to ask a bold request of each of you. And that's for you to be in the listening of me from this point forward, from a place of possibility and a place of humanity, where you start to explore how this issue is important to you. I'll be sure to tell you how it's important to me, but this conversation becomes very different when we're enrolled in it together. Is that something you can do? Good, I believe you. Okay. So I gave you a laundry list of occupations at the beginning, and none of them said that I was a fortune teller, because I'm not. But I can still tell what you're thinking about female genital mutilation and cutting. And for some of you, you're thinking, what a tragedy. For others of you, you're thinking, this is totally about religion. And for the majority of you, you're thinking, female genital mutilation and cutting only happens in Africa. The reality is that female genital mutilation and cutting is a practice that spans the globe, and it has neither any medical nor religious underpinnings. Nearly 200,000 women and girls here in the United States have been or are at threat of being impacted by female genital mutilation and cutting. Cases of female genital mutilation and cutting have been reported in every state with the exception of Hawaii. And the greatest numbers have been reported in California, Minnesota, and right here in New York. In the New York metropolitan area, there are nearly 65,000 women and girls impacted by female genital mutilation and cutting or vacation cutting, which is the practice of sending girls to their families' home countries to be cut during winter, summer, or spring break. Both of these practices are illegal in New York. Now I can tell by your faces, the numbers that I've just stated are shocking to some and sobering to most. But the reality is that these numbers are outdated, they're growing nationally, and they're growing even greater globally. And I know this because I've had the good fortune of working in every continent with the exception of Antarctica. And while I can sometimes feel like I've been a little bit of everywhere, Flatbush is my home. So in growing up on Ocean Avenue, my kindergarten school was on the same block. And one day in class, at the denial of many of my requests to go to the bathroom to urinate, I fibbed and told my teacher that I needed to vomit because I knew how important it was to not spoil myself in class. While alone in the bathroom, my male teacher followed me inside, holding a leather belt in hand, inquiring if I'd actually vomited. In that moment, while I wasn't exactly sure why I was afraid, it's definitely one of the first times that I'd ever sensed fear. And because of that, I told him I'd vomited in the adjacent stall. When he went inside to confirm, I bolted out of the loo, straight out of the building, and home to my mom. So why do I share that story with you today? For a long time, I didn't talk about that incident at all because I thought I'd done something wrong, and I was ashamed. I folded that incident deeper and deeper into the recesses of my mind, so much so that I thought I'd forgotten about it. And while I did that, I jumped deeper and deeper into activist work around female genital mutilation and cutting, domestic violence, anti-human trafficking, sexual assault, without any real sense about where my motivation stemmed. In fact, when people asked, how I got into the work of female genital mutilation and cutting, I often said blankly, I don't know. But with some deep diving, I remembered that fateful day in the bathroom in Flatbush, when I was alone, at 5, with an adult male, holding what I considered to be a weapon. And in that instant, all of the years of my work creating freedoms for women and girls culminated into that one moment where we were all that same little girl. Whether we were avoiding an unsolicited whipping by a male adult, whether we were surviving sexual assault from a stricken partner, or whether we were facing a vaginal cutting from a family or community member. I used to shirk at that day, and now it's become a day that I've come to appreciate. You see, it's the day that my stake in the ground got planted, and it's been my anchor ever since. You see, today I became an activist at 5, so that other little girls never have to feel the peril at the hands of adults that they're entrusted to, including little girls impacted by female genital mutilation and cutting. Because of the efforts of my sister activists, 34 states have responsive legislation on female genital mutilation and cutting. Withstanding their efforts, it is still not unconstitutional to practice female genital mutilation and cutting in the United States. This means that the issue of female genital mutilation and cutting has been resigned to an individual state's matter that the federal government has legislated itself permission to be silent on. In short, the issue of women being able to govern and have choice over our own bodies is still outside of our reach. This sound familiar to anybody? Yeah, I would think so. I've spent a lot of time telling you what is, and I haven't said what's not. I'm not a survivor of female genital mutilation and cutting. I'm not an immigrant. And I'm not from a community that practices female genital mutilation and cutting. But I'm still that 5-year-old little girl in the bathroom, alone with a male, afraid. And it's for those reasons that I advocate for others to have liberties over their own bodies, because that's a right that's entitled to everyone. And we don't need to be a woman or an immigrant to want that. I got that lesson best from my former legal clients. When I graduated from law school, I created New York City's only holistic legal services program for African survivors of domestic violence. This work became some of the most demanding and some of the most rewarding work I've been able to do to date. So much so that my clients nicknamed me the little lawyer. And while it's really endearing to be their little lawyer, they became some of my biggest teachers. One evening while preparing for an order of protection trial, I peppered away at my client about questions of her abuse. And no matter what my question was, her only response was, "I've never had an orgasm." I thought, she's nervous about our trial, right? But the reality is that she self-identified as a survivor of female genital mutilation and cutting. And what I learned from her was that not only was she someone who had never had an orgasm, she was 50 years old and a mother of 4. And she taught me that her experience as a survivor of female genital mutilation and cutting wasn't the sum total of who she was as a person. From her, I learned that she experienced vaginal bacterial infections, vaginal keloids, anemia every month during her menses, and difficulty urinating every day. She taught me that as a survivor of female genital mutilation and cutting, her symptoms were just the tip of the iceberg for those who experience this practice, depending on what type of cutting they've endured. My second teacher was yet another client who asked me to call her mother-in-law to stop her from cutting her daughter because she thought she might listen to me as an authority figure. And my third teacher was yet another client who outwardly asked me if I would help her get her daughter back from her home country before she was cut. You see, her husband had sent her there as a form of retaliation for her pursuing an order of protection here in the United States. It's because of these instances that I really got that the issue of female genital mutilation and cutting isn't a far-off, distant occurrence, but it's a local phenomenon in which man-made boundaries don't dictate behavior. The reality is that my colleague, my friend, my neighbor, my student, my friend, anyone could possibly be at risk. I want to play a game. Is anybody up for playing a game with me? Okay, one person. Everybody? Okay. Okay, good. 5 people. Okay, great. When I started, I gave you the definition of female genital mutilation and cutting. And I said that it's a practice that involves the cutting or the complete removal of the clitoris and or the sewing together of the labias. My ask is that you hold this definition in mind. And now I invite you all to close your eyes. Don't worry about your purses. I got you. Remember, I'm from Flatbush. Now, with your eyes closed, have a think about what your favorite body part is. And I know everyone in this room has one, even if you say that you don't. It's probably that spot you gave a little extra love into this morning in the mirror. And for the folks in the room who identify as male, you probably know what your spot is, and that's okay, as long as everybody has one. Okay, cool. Now, with your eyes still closed, imagine that you are in the company of family and community members, and you are forcibly held down against your will. And that favorite body part that you just identified is removed from you without your permission, and likely without you even knowing that this is going to happen. Putting the physical harms aside for a moment, what's left to be understood of your sense of trust and safety? How are you expected to navigate the world theoretically intact when something so sacred's been removed from you? Who are you expected to go to for help when the people who likely conducted the act are the people who are supposed to be dedicated to your protection? If your eyes are still closed, you're welcome to open them. And whatever your answers were to those questions, it's exactly for those reasons that the issue of female genital mutilation and cutting deserves to be reframed as a human rights issue that's inclusive of women's rights, children's rights, public health, mental health, and community education. Reshifting the issue of female genital mutilation and cutting in this way moves this issue outside of our universal blind spot and into our collective consciousness, where there's a forum created for the women and girls impacted by this issue here in the United States have a place to be seen and a place to be heard. Each time we shift the political assault on women's bodies, whether it's the issue of female genital mutilation and cutting, domestic violence, anti-human trafficking, sexual assault, abortion, or whatever else you can create, the staunchest of patriarchy and male supremacy are ever more eviscerated. So I don't know a lot of things, but I know that it's often harder to move people than it is to move issues sometimes. And my hope is that a shift has happened today and that you were moved. For some of you, you'll say you need a clearer call to action. And unfortunately, I can't give you that. You see, I can't teach you how to be humane. But I can remind you of the fear that I felt at 5, alone with an adult male. I can ask you to recall how you felt just a few moments ago when you thought that your favorite body part might be in jeopardy. And I can encourage you to think about your impact on the world and what your capacity can be on the world that we all share. And so, my invitation is for you to accompany me in being a co-creator in a more gender-just world. Will you join me? Thank you.